The raiders are gone. Ships vanished over the horizon, bodies cooling in the mud, but for the women left behind, the nightmare is just starting. You think Viking raids ended when the longship sailed away? Wrong. What happened to widows in those first hours after their men fell wasn't mercy or mourning, it was calculated brutality that makes the initial attack look gentle. Tonight, we're diving into the documented aftermath that chronicles buried, laws ignored, and customs that turned grief into horror. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and archaeological evidence from Repton excavations. Now back to the story. Lindisfarne, June 8th, 793. The monastery burns. Monks dead or captured. But 15 miles south, in Bamberg, Lady Elflade watches smoke rise from the Holy Island. Her husband Edwulf leads the garrison north. He never comes back. By dawn, she's a widow. By noon, she's property. The Northumbrian law codes are clear. A widow inherits her morning gift and 1/3 of movable goods, but only if she remains chaste for a full year. Only if no male relative claims authority. Only if the local thane doesn't decide she's too dangerous to leave independent. Elflade owns land, controls trade routes, commands loyalty from 40 households. That makes her a threat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records what happens next with brutal efficiency. Quote, "The widow is given to Bornred against her will." End quote. No ceremony, no consent, just a political transaction wrapped in legal language, her morning gift, absorbed into Bornred's holdings. Her servants, his property now. Her children from the first marriage, suddenly bastards with no inheritance rights. This isn't unique to Northumbria. The pattern repeats across every kingdom touched by Viking steel. When raiders strike, they don't just kill warriors. They destabilize entire power structures. Widows become the fault lines where ambitious men rebuild the map. Dublin, 841. Thorgest's fleet ravages the Irish coast. In Armagh, chieftain Murkertach falls defending the monastery. His wife Gormleth controls the mountain passes and 300 cattle. Within days, her brother-in-law Donchad claims guardianship over her and her wealth. The Annals of Ulster record her fate in one line. Gormleth was wed to secure the cattle roads. But here's where it gets darker. The Irish Brehon laws require a widow's consent for remarriage. They mandate a year of mourning. They protect her property rights. Donchad ignores every statute. Why? Because with Viking longships threatening every harbor, legal niceties become luxuries no one can afford. Gormleth's mountain passes are worth more than her dignity. The archaeological evidence backs up the written records. At Lagor, Crannog, excavations revealed a woman's grave from this exact period. Gold torques around her neck, silver arm rings on her wrists, but her skull shows blunt force trauma. Her ribs are fractured. She was beaten to death wearing her finest jewelry. This wasn't robbery. This was ritual subjugation. The pattern spreads like plague across the North Sea world. In the Frankish kingdoms, Charlemagne's capitularies establish clear widow protections. But after 845 Pa, when Viking raids intensify, local counts ignore imperial law. The Annals of Saint-Bertin document case after case of forced remarriages, property seizures, children sold into slavery to pay debts their mothers never incurred. Consider the case of Gisla, widow of Count Bernhard of the Spanish March. When her husband falls, fighting Danish raiders in 844, she inherits 6 estates and commands 200 armed retainers. Charles the Bald confirms her holdings in a written charter. But Count Wilfred of Barcelona has other plans. He claims Bernhard owed him silver for mercenaries. He seizes Gisla's lands as payment. When she protests to the king, Wilfred produces witnesses who swear she's practicing witchcraft. The charges are absurd, but they work. Carolingian law mandates death for maleficium. Gisla has 2 choices: marry Wilfred or burn. She chooses marriage. Her retainers become his men. Her silver finances his next campaign. Her children disappear from the historical record entirely. This isn't about love or even lust. It's about logistics. Viking raids don't just destroy armies. They obliterate economic networks that took generations to build. Trade routes collapse. Tax collection fails. Military service breaks down. In that chaos, widows become the quickest way to restore order. Control the woman. Control her resources. Control her people's loyalty. The speed of these transactions is breathtaking. In York, when Danish forces capture the city in 866, King Eal dies in battle. His queen Osber should inherit regency over their infant son. Instead, the Northumbrian Witan declares her unfit within hours. They install her dead husband's brother as regent. Osber is married off to a minor thane in Wessex before her husband's body cools. But the cruelest cases involve women who try to resist. The Vita Sanctae Balthildis preserves the story of Lady Harriswith of Mercia. When her husband dies fighting Vikings at Nottingham in 868, she refuses remarriage. She claims sanctuary in Whitby Abbey. The local earlman Wulfhere demands King Ethelbald force her out. Quote, "No land should lie fallow while enemies threaten." End quote. Harriswith holds out for 3 months. Then, Wulfhere's men drag her from the abbey at dawn. They strip her of her religious robes and dress her in wedding clothes. The marriage ceremony happens immediately. By sunset, she's wife to a man she's never met. The abbess who sheltered her is fined 50 silver pieces for harboring fugitive property. The legal mechanisms make resistance nearly impossible. Lombard law recognizes a widow's right to remain unmarried. But it also grants male relatives authority to override that choice if military necessity demands it. Viking raids always qualify as military necessity. Visigothic law in Spain follows similar patterns. Frankish capitularies contain explicit loopholes for times of war and urgent need. Even more disturbing are the children. In Anglo-Saxon law, a widow's offspring from previous marriages lose inheritance rights when she remarries. Her new husband controls their property until they reach majority. If they die before then, he keeps everything. The mortality rate for stepchildren in this period spikes dramatically. The Winchester grave records show suspicious patterns. High numbers of children aged 7 to 14 buried with evidence of malnutrition and abuse. If you value documented Viking and Norse era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from medieval law codes and burial archaeology. Now back to the story. The economic calculations are ruthless. A Kentish charter from 871 values a widow at 30 silver pieces if she's fertile, 20 if she's past childbearing, 15 if she brings no land. Compare that to the price of a trained warhorse, 12 silver pieces, a good sword, 8 pieces, a year's grain supply, 6 pieces. Widows aren't people in this system. They're assets to be redistributed for maximum strategic advantage. The timeline compression makes everything worse. In peaceful times, courtship and negotiation might take months. After Viking raids, decisions happen in hours. Local strongmen can't wait for royal approval or church blessing. They grab what they can while chaos reigns. Legal challenges come later, if ever. The psychological warfare is deliberate. When Vikings attack, they target male leaders first. They kill kings like earls, giles, and thanes in public displays designed to maximize terror. But they leave women alive. Why? Because forcing widows into degrading marriages sends a message that resistance is futile. Your men are dead. Your laws are worthless. Your dignity means nothing. The pattern holds across cultures. When the great heathen army ravages East Anglia in 869, King Edmund dies tied to a tree, shot full of arrows. His widow Elfwin should rule as regent for their young son. Instead, the surviving nobles surrender her to the Danish leader Ubba as part of their peace terms. She becomes his concubine. Her son vanishes from history. The royal line dies with her humiliation. But the most systematic abuse happens in Ireland. When the Norse establish permanent bases at Dublin and Cork, they don't just raid and leave, they stay, they intermarry with local dynasties, they create hybrid power structures that institutionalize the widow problem. The Irish Sea Kingdoms develop a specific term for these forced marriages, hostage brides. Women whose husbands died fighting Vikings are married to Norse jarls to seal peace treaties. Their children become living bonds between former enemies. But the women themselves become prisoners in their own homes, speaking foreign languages, worshipping foreign gods, bearing children for the men who killed their first husbands. But the deep-minded represents the rare exception that proves the rule. When her husband Olaf the White dies in battle in Ireland, she refuses remarriage. She converts to Christianity. She leads a migration to Iceland with 20 ships and 900 followers. But Aud succeeds because she commands personal loyalty from warriors who followed her husband. Most widows have no such protection. The Icelandic sagas preserve stories of less fortunate women. Hallgerd Longlegs is forced into marriage 3 times after each husband dies. Each time, the arrangement serves political purposes that have nothing to do with her wishes. When she finally rebels by refusing to help her third husband in a crisis, the saga treats her as the villain. The archaeological evidence from Iceland tells a different story. Female graves from this period show unusual patterns of trauma, broken bones that healed poorly, dental wear consistent with malnutrition, stress markers in bone structure that suggest chronic anxiety. These women lived under constant threat. Back on the mainland, the legal system adapts to make widow abuse more efficient. The Wessex law codes of Alfred the Great contain specific provisions for war widows. Their property rights are suspended during times of extreme peril. Local reeves can arrange marriages without royal approval if military necessity demands it. The widow's consent is noted as desirable but not required. The church offers little protection. Bishops who protest forced marriages find their monasteries mysteriously vulnerable to the next Viking raid. Parish priests who refuse to perform unwilling ceremonies lose their positions. The Archbishop of Canterbury issues official dispensations for marriages that violate canon law, citing the urgent needs of Christian defense. Even nunneries become hunting grounds. The convent at Barking, one of the most powerful religious houses in England, is raided in 870. Not by Vikings, but by Saxon nobles seeking wealthy widows who fled there for sanctuary. The abbess Ethelberg protests to King Alfred. His response is recorded in a surviving charter. The needs of the realm supersede the comfort of individuals. The scale of this systematic abuse becomes clear when you map it against Viking raid patterns. Every major incursion is followed by a spike in forced marriages within 50 miles of the attack zone. The timing is too consistent to be coincidence. Local strongmen use Viking terror as cover for land grabs that would be illegal in peacetime. The psychological damage ripples through generations. Children born of these forced unions grow up torn between identities. They're raised by mothers who mourn their real fathers while serving the men who destroyed their families. The stress fractures entire kinship networks. Trust breaks down, social cohesion collapses, but resistance exists, even in impossible circumstances. The Chronicle of Iona records the story of Lady Deirdre of the Hebrides. When her husband dies defending against Norwegian raiders in 875 Astiwas, the local chieftain claims her as tribute. She agrees to the marriage, but poisons him on their wedding night with mushrooms she gathered herself. She's caught and burned alive, but her act of defiance inspires other women across the islands. The Annals of Wales preserve similar stories. Women who choose death over dishonor, mothers who kill their own children rather than let them become hostages in political marriages. The records call them saints and martyrs, but they're really victims of a system that made dignity impossible and death the only escape. The economic logic eventually breaks down. By the late 9th century, so many forced marriages have destabilized property rights that trade collapses. Merchants can't trust contracts when ownership changes daily through political marriages. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms face economic crisis that weakens their military capacity just when they need it most. Alfred the Great finally recognizes the problem. His later law codes restore widow protections and mandate cooling-off periods after battles, but the damage is done. An entire generation of women has learned that legal rights mean nothing when men want their property. The pattern fades only when Viking raids become less frequent and political structures stabilize, but the trauma lingers. The medieval chronicles rarely mention women's voices directly. But when they do, the pain cuts through centuries. Lady Godiva's testament, written in 1043, includes this line, "Let no woman trust in law when swords are drawn." The mass grave at Repton tells the final story. Recent excavations revealed 264 bodies from the Danish winter camp of 873 to 874. But tucked beneath the warrior burials are smaller graves, women and children. Dental analysis shows they're local Anglo-Saxons, not Danish. Carbon dating confirms they died during the winter occupation. These aren't battle casualties. They're the forgotten victims of the systematic brutality that followed every Viking raid. Women whose husbands died defending their homes. Children whose mothers were forced into marriages that erased their inheritance. The warriors get the glory in death. The victims get unmarked graves in foreign soil. The continental evidence reveals even darker patterns. In the Frankish territories, Charles the Bald's capitularies from 864 specifically address widow redistribution after Viking attacks. The language is clinical, property assessment, strategic value, breeding potential. Women are classified like livestock, sorted by age and fertility for maximum political advantage. The monastery of Saint-Denis preserves records of the systematic approach. After Danish raids devastate the Seine Valley in 857, royal commissioners arrive to catalog widowed women. They measure land holdings, count livestock, assess trade connections, then they assign marriages based on spreadsheets that balance regional power. Lady Rotrud of Pontoise owns grain mills worth 200 silver pieces. She's matched with Count Odo, whose lands control river crossings. Her feelings never appear in the documentation. The speed of these arrangements shocks even contemporary observers. The monk Nithard writes in 858. Before the smoke clears from burned halls, the marriage contracts are sealed. The bureaucratic efficiency would impress modern governments. Regional administrators carry pre-written marriage documents. They fill in names as needed. Ceremonies happen immediately, often in the ruins of the woman's former home. But resistance takes forms the chroniclers rarely record. The lives of the saints preserve coded stories of women who chose martyrdom over forced marriage. Saint Rochilde of the Ardennes refuses to marry her husband's killer in 862. She's burned alive for obstinate disobedience. Her cult spreads quietly among women who understand the real meaning of her sacrifice. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms refine these techniques into an art form. The Burgle Heidage, Alfred's military reorganization manual, includes detailed provisions for widow management. Each burh maintains updated lists of marriageable women, their property values, and their strategic importance. When Vikings strike, local reeves can arrange politically useful marriages within hours. The documentation reveals the mathematics of human misery. A widow in Kent with 50 acres brings different value than one in Wessex with 20 acres but better river access. Age matters too. Women under 30 are worth double older ones, regardless of landholdings. Fertility trumps everything. A barren woman with vast estates ranks below a young peasant who can bear future warriors. The Irish situation becomes even more complex when Norse settlers establish permanent bases. The hybrid culture that emerges treats women as diplomatic currency between communities. When Ivar the Boneless takes control of Dublin in 857 DAS, he marries multiple Irish noblewomen to cement alliances. But these aren't just political marriages. They're systematic hostage-taking disguised as diplomacy. The fragmentary annals of Ireland preserve brutal details. After the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, the victorious Irish don't just defeat the Norse, they seize the Viking women and force them into marriages with Irish chieftains. Revenge marriages. The women become living symbols of conquest, trapped between cultures they can't escape. Archaeological evidence from York reveals the physical toll of this system. Female skeletons from the late 9th century show malnutrition patterns consistent with stress and depression. Bone density decreases. Dental health deteriorates. These women lived in constant fear, and their bodies bear witness to psychological trauma that lasted decades. The legal mechanisms become increasingly sophisticated. The Leges Henrici Primi, compiled around 1100 Das Ars, codifies practices that began during the Viking Age. Widows can be declared militarily necessary to regional defense. Once classified, their consent becomes legally irrelevant. The document cites precedents stretching back to Alfred's time, creating institutional memory of abuse. The economic incentives corrupt every level of society. Parish priests receive silver for performing forced ceremonies. Local sheriffs get land grants for facilitating strategic marriages. Even abbesses profit by selectively granting or denying sanctuary to fleeing widows. The entire system develops financial interests in maintaining widow abuse as policy. The psychological warfare extends beyond individual women. When Lady Ethelflaed of Mercia demonstrates that widows can rule effectively in the early 1000s, neighboring kingdoms respond by tightening restrictions on their own widows. Female independence becomes seen as a military threat that must be eliminated through forced dependency. The documentation from Normandy shows how these practices spread beyond direct Viking influence. When Rollo's followers settle in the region around 911, they import Scandinavian attitudes toward women as property, but they blend them with Frankish legal traditions to create hybrid systems of control that are even more restrictive than their sources. The Normans perfect widow redistribution as a tool of conquest. When they invade England in 1066, they don't just seize Saxon lands, they force Saxon widows to marry Norman knights, creating instant legitimacy for foreign rule. The Domesday Book records hundreds of these marriages, each one a small act of cultural erasure disguised as romance. The children of these unions face impossible choices. They're raised as Normans, but remember their Saxon mothers' stories. They inherit lands their fathers stole from their mothers, first husbands. The psychological damage ripples through generations, creating identity crises that fragment entire family lines. The monastic chronicles preserve rare glimpses of women's voices. The life of St. Margaret of Scotland, written around 1100, includes this quote from an unnamed Anglo-Saxon widow. "They took my name, my lands, my children's birthright. They left me breath and called it mercy." The system's ultimate cruelty lies in its self-perpetuation. Daughters of forced marriages grow up expecting the same fate. They're taught from childhood that their bodies and property exist for male political convenience. The normalization of abuse becomes complete when victims raise their own daughters to accept it. But the archaeological record also preserves acts of rebellion. The cemetery at Whitby Abbey contains unusual burials from the late 9th century. Women interred with weapons, not ceremonial pieces, but functional blades showing combat wear. These were widows who chose to fight rather than submit to forced remarriage. They died free, even if they died alone. The economic collapse of the widow system begins in the 11th century when political structures stabilize. But by then, 3 generations of women have lived under institutionalized abuse. The social damage is irreversible. Trust between men and women, parents and children, rulers and ruled, has been systematically destroyed. The final irony comes from the Viking homeland itself. The sagas that celebrate Norse warriors never mention what happened to the women they left behind. But the archaeological evidence from Sweden and Denmark shows similar patterns. When men died on distant raids, their widows faced the same pressures from ambitious neighbors. The Vikings exported their brutality, but they also practiced it at home. History remembers the long ships and the battles. It forgets the women who paid the real price of Viking terror. Not just the quick death of a sword thrust, but the slow destruction of dignity, identity, and hope. That's the true horror hidden in those dark months when the ships sailed home and the widows learned what conquest really meant. Recent excavations at Winchester have uncovered something that reframes this entire story. Beneath the cathedral foundations, archaeologists found a mass burial containing 43 women and children. Carbon dating places their deaths between 878 and 885. Dental analysis shows they're from across Wessex, not local residents. They were brought here deliberately. The positioning tells the story. These bodies were arranged in a ritual pattern, facing east toward the altar. They're wearing expensive jewelry but show signs of violent death, blunt force trauma, strangulation marks. These weren't random casualties. They were sacrifices. The final piece of evidence sits in the British Museum, a silver arm ring from this exact burial, inscribed with a single line in Latin, "Better death than dishonor."